Welcome to the Tao of Cybersecurity Part 1. This is one of a series of lectures on the way or method or path of cybersecurity that I've given to apprentices and beginners in the cybersecurity career field for years now. It incorporates current understanding and knowledge and kind of wraps my opinion and a lot of information into one area for you to hopefully pull out some gems that you can use in your own cybersecurity career. And what I always do at the beginning of this lecture is really touch on one of the endless and probably most useless debates in our field, and that is whether cybersecurity is an art or a science. Now, let me answer this question so we can kind of move on. And you might be asking yourself, like, why even bring this up? Well, it tends to split our career field a lot. It makes it very divisive, especially at the higher skill levels. We debate this back and forth, and really the answer is a mixture of both. It's a little science, it's a little art. How much of each depends on how you were taught and what tools are at your disposal. If you have a lot of tools that allow you to do controlled experiments and look at information in a organized, regular manner in kind of controlled environments, then it can be more scientific potentially and less of an art. If you don't have access to things like that and it's very much your own effort and a lot of the techniques and methods you use are very unique to you, then you're performing something that's more artistic in nature. It doesn't mean that somebody else couldn't repeat it. It just means that it's more of a heroic, individual, artistic endeavor on your part when you're in that mode. And typically, you're more artistic when you're developing new ways of doing things, and you're more scientific when you're using something that has been shown to be repeatable and consistent and so forth. Again, I bring this up because it does take a lot of cycles in the cybersecurity community, and I always like to kind of knock it out right off the bat. So with that in mind, really getting into the core of what we're supposed to be talking about, even though that is really linked to it, it's important to talk about cybersecurity and a few of its core concepts. And in fact, again, before diving into cybersecurity and exploring more, it's really important to establish a clear idea of the term information security, because information security and cybersecurity are not necessarily identical synonyms. They're not necessarily synonyms or identical defined words. Really, information security is kind of an underpinning. It's something that cybersecurity grew out of, and it's necessary to define before breaking out cybersecurity as a definition. And to do that, there's one of the easy ways to do that is kind of to break it out in the CIA Triad. And there's lots of ways to depict this. This happens to be the one I'm using here today. People kind of do this either as a triangle sometimes, or they use all different kinds of shape. But really what we want to talk about is three areas that overlap each other: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And you'll see this rule. This is kind of an analytical tool, and it's used in a lot of ways. We're going to use it today to talk about these three areas. And you can see definitions, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit. But I'll hopefully make those a little simpler. In the context of threat intelligence, cybersecurity, cyber intelligence, whatever you want to call it, confidentiality, I want you to think of it as privacy. It's really that set of rules. And its job there is to limit access to information. Not limit your information, but to make sure the right people are accessing it when they should access it. And integrity, that red bubble down there on the bottom left, is maintaining the consistency, accuracy, and trustworthiness of data over its entire life cycle. So from birth to from cradle to grave, as they say. So when it's created to when you dispose of it. And availability is that guarantee that it'll be there reliably when authorized people need to access it. And the key word there is authorized. Now, all three elements of the CIA Triad are equally crucial and important to information security, any scenario of information security. But cybersecurity, which kind of grew out of this, is more really concerned about data privacy. And so with that in mind, it cares more about the confidentiality, the green circle, and the availability, the blue circle of the CIA Triad. It kind of leaves the third one, the red one, data integrity, off to other elements to be dealt with elsewhere. Information security likes all three, tries to match all of them, tries to make sure they're all there. Cybersecurity, though, focuses more on the other two, the confidentiality and availability. And you'll see this talked about in many ways. I'm just trying to render it in as simple fast as I can. And in fact, if you look at my diagram, it's worth noting that I put the shield and the lock right there in the middle, kind of implying that all three do this evenly, but the honest fact is no, they don't. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about cybersecurity. It's good to get a definition under our belt here. I won't read all this, but I will touch on a couple of things. And don't mind the graphics. That's not my strength. Talking about cybersecurity happens to be my strength. Making new, cool graphics is not. But hopefully it conveys what I'm talking about. And you'll see the CIA again here. Now, cybersecurity. This is a very ornate definition, but it's important because it incorporates many concepts that are Good for you to understand. So at its heart, it's the state of being protected against unauthorized or criminal use of electronic data. In a better way, I want you to think prevention. I want you to think stopping someone. I want you to think about reorganizing your network to prevent people from getting into places or exposing things you shouldn't. I want you to think disruption. That means getting ahead of an attacker, getting ahead of someone that's unauthorized and stopping, preventing, or mitigating their capability, tar pitting them, like they letting them get in, or they do get in, and if they do, they get stuck somewhere. Think proactive engagement where you counter before they even start. So you do a disruptive attack, or you adjust things, or you have what we call organized chaos, where you shift things on a regular basis to create a state of what looks like chaos to your attacker, and also proactively disrupts their capability. Any of those and all are valid, because cybersecurity at its core is all about stopping the accessing, the finding, contacting, and knowing of data by unauthorized people. Attackers don't attack you if they don't know you exist, but you can't just hide in obscurity. It's different if you take proactive measures to prevent your data exposure, let's say, because you look at your threat surface and you reduce that visibility of an attacker outside your organization, like you keep data and the information that's there where it's supposed to. Now, this is a lot. Don't be alarmed if you find this definition, like I said earlier, overly ornate or complex. I'm putting out a lot of different concepts here that we haven't really touched on, and if you're new to this industry, you may not have under your belt. But it's important here, and my primary goal is to give you a foundation definition for cybersecurity. Now, armed with that, let's set some more foundational work. You can see here I've already tossed up observational science, because it's important to talk about cybersecurity as being a logical subject of study. We are in many ways a science, and when viewed at a science type, cybersecurity is a hybrid of both observational science and descriptive science. And don't worry, we're going to go through those. Not expecting you to have those definitions handy, in fact, so I'm going to go ahead and touch on them. That's why you see the definition for observational science in front of you. And it's really a field of study, as it states there, where controlled observations cannot be made in order to study causes and effects. Now, I know that sounds weird because I'm saying cannot be made, but it's important. That's exactly what I meant. You cannot make a controlled observation. In observational science, this kind of science is performed through the observation of nature, just taking its course, and you recording the findings over time. This is in opposition to experimental sciences that advance via controlled experiments. As an example, think of astronomy, a science where a person can't change the movement or any other aspect of the sun, moon, and stars, nor can they go visit them. Another one might be climate science. In climate science, there's really only one subject, one test subject, Earth. We don't have the luxury of three similar planets in which we can pull out C2O and from one and add it to another and then compare that with Earth. We don't have any options like that to observe what's happening and record what's going on in climate science. We're kind of stuck with Earth and in an uncontrollable way at that matter. Cybersecurity is the exact same. Not completely, but definitely partially. We observe cyber attackers like we observe the stars of the climate. And it's a major part of cybersecurity. So it seems clear, and I want to make it very clear to you, that cybersecurity is, at least partially, definitely an observational science. A science where the observations of causes and effects may be extremely difficult, if not sometimes impossible, to identify, model, effect, or control. And you may go, well, then why bother? Because you need this. Even though observational sciences have their limitations, observing science taking its course means there are many variables involved, and in research, only one or a few can be accounted for. So to pinpoint one cause, and only one, you have to isolate factors and change them while keeping other factors the same. That's kind of more experimental science than observational science, because they can actually change one output, one input, one factor, and then see what else was changed. That's the strength of experimental science. And sadly, we don't have that as observational science. It's kind of the big difference there. We can't do that in cybersecurity. We can't ask a cyber attacker to hang out and let us run a bunch of controlled experiments. Hey, can you run that malware again, but just leave the C2 this way? Can you do it again and change the C2? Sometimes we get lucky and we see multiple impacts from an attacker. It's both lucky and unlucky, right? If an attacker gets multiple entrances into companies, that's bad because it harms them. It's kind of good in the observational side, though, because we get to sort of emulate the experimental science structure where we can see very similar things happening with only one or two factors change. But honestly, most of the time, we see the elements of cybersecurity a lot like we see the stars. They're kind of distant and mostly out of control, if not completely out of control. And this is really super important to comprehend in sciences. The consequences of the study in observing are in the extent that you can draw conclusions about causality. One thing causes another, or something is caused by something else, causality at its basis. We're going to dig into that just a little bit more here in a second. But there's always a risk that some variable, when you're observing it, you observed wasn't the real cause. And it can drive you to make the wrong assumption that that measured variable was it. That's the one that caused it. It did it. But the reality could be very different. There could be many unmeasured variables that are impacting this, and it's not well understood in your observational model, and therefore your results could be easily wrong or misconstrued, or worse, get out in the media and then easily get whipped up into a big frenzy. Mixing up the understanding and accuracy of information from that type of study is exactly what leads analysts astray when they perform attribution. It's exactly where analysts link actions they observe to an actor group, but they don't have the full view. They don't even have enough of a view or have used logic to tie it all together well, and so they make misattributions, or they make attributions that are absolutely incorrect. And personally, I call this the swamp. It sinks everybody if they're not careful, but whatever. I digress. Let me get back on topic here. The whole point here is for cybersecurity, observational study is necessary, but it's difficult. It's just like astronomy or climate science. In this case, for cybersecurity, it's because of the hugely complex and constantly evolving nature. For example, a computer connected to an open network, just in this use case alone, demonstrates the variability that the same computer, that one computer, can be potentially subject to countless risks, frequently difficult to understand ones at that, and constantly changing exploit vulnerabilities. That doesn't even begin to talk about the potential for multiple human attackers, plus all their software and machine helpers, who may try to sweep away any kind of security protection you happen to have in place. So you're sitting in a coffee shop, you connect to the network. It doesn't matter that you're connecting over VPN if by the very fact of binding to that router at that coffee shop, it compromises your machine. It did not matter. The events overtook any kind of protections that might have been put in place. And that might be very difficult to observe, especially when you bind back to the company network 3 weeks later. Knowing when you got and how you got compromised might be completely impossible to observe. So it's just an example issue. And from this common issue, I really want to bring up that you need to think that cybersecurity is both out of control and in control, but mostly out of control as far as observations go. You really have to focus and double down on making analytical observations of real-world security systems regularly. And if you're in a company, it has to be a critical part of any of your cybersecurity practices. I know I kind of jumped a little bit around there, but know that observational science is the key part you need to bring from here. And I mentioned cause and effect, and since I brought it up, let me go ahead and talk about that for a second. Cause and effect is a funny way to say causality. And causality is not exactly the easiest thing to understand. It's a squiggly, weirdo diagram of things, and sometimes it can take a lot of intuition to pick up. But you'll hear causality and you hear cause and effect relationships all kind of thrown around, and they are indeed relatively identical. Cause and effect relationships are very critical inside of cybersecurity, and though they don't get the mainstream of media, mainly because that's a background analyst area of cybersecurity, they are important, and let's cover the definition. So I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to try to break it down for you. Causality or cause and effect is or an influence by which one event, process, state, or object, the cause, contributes to the production of another event, process, state, or object, the effect, where the cause is partially responsible for the effect, and the effect is partially dependent on the cause. And in reality, there's rarely a one-for-one. In fact, a process has typically many causes, of which are said to be causal factors that are all historical. They all are in the past. And an effect is in turn a cause or causal factor for many other effects, which all lie in the future. Confused yet? Causality is kind of a tough subject to get under your belt. It takes a bit of intuition to kind of incorporate this, but I will try to slice through that. In a simplest way, I can say causality is an abstraction of how the world works / progresses. It's a logical framework for explaining the concepts of progression. And that's really all you need to know. Causality is all about saying something caused something else, and the something else is the effect, right? And if you can grab onto the part that causality is all about how the world works and how things progress, you can use intuition to kind of make other leaps and really jump into deeper parts of causality. It's really, like I said, not the easiest thing to get under your belt, but it's still important. One other thing or another thing, I should say, and hopefully you like my little gaming reference here. Cybersecurity is a struggle. People talk about this. They're like, it's a war, it's a conflict, it's this, it's that. Really, I tend to think of it like it's more like a military conflict or a political struggle. Excuse me. It's best explained as our networks and computers, our use of them in life and business, whatever, they kind of exist in this constantly changing, highly charged, and unstable technical and social environment where an unknown number of unknown enemies may at any point launch a successful cyber attack. I know that's a mouthful, but it's really, really important to note. We kind of live in this highly charged, unstable, chaotic environment, but we strive at the same time for solidity and constance. That's the struggle. That's the conflict. One that cybersecurity is deeply involved in. And where it's notable to say the application of science, like in any other war, is really the path to succeed, but science alone won't get us there. It'll just open the door. Because the problem is clever foes, armed with ever-improving technical tools and methods, will work constantly to try and break any security measure that are put in place. So we have to kind of incorporate into our understanding that cybersecurity is not purely logical. That's why it's not completely a science. It's always a mixture. You can't just use logical predictions to win. You can't use that to find out what's going on. You have to include observational methods to test things, to build countermeasures, to put things in a real environment and try them out and deploy them. And you might be thinking, wow, okay, that's really interesting. I'm glad you told me that, but what's that have to do with cause and effect? Kind of a lot in some ways. It's not that cause and effects are unimportant or super overly important when it comes to cybersecurity, but they're really there. They're necessary, right? Or that they become redundant, right? Both the important or unimportant part, because they haven't in any case. It's what I want you to understand is it's causality. You need to have an understanding of it so that you know that one thing leads to another. But you also need to realize that it's really difficult to follow. It's really difficult to source, predict, or even really employ, mainly because of the complexity of doing so, of the problem in many cases, or the complexity of the deceptive and illicit methods an opponent might have used to try to cover up what they did. So what's a common tactic in phishing? They'll take over somebody's email account that's trusted, and then they will phish you from this trusted account. Eventually, you'll figure out that you were phished, but when you look back and you follow the links back, you come back to a trusted account. They use some kind of deceptive or illicit method there to cover up what they were doing. So your logical framework may not have predicted that your best friend who always sends you emails all of a sudden would compromise you. It's not in your predictive model. This is why prediction alone, especially AI-driven prediction, will never work as a standalone. It has to be bound to observation. And so I don't want you to take away that I'm saying logic is unneeded or necessary, but separately, rather to succeed, we need to make visible all the logical factors we can, everything that's possible. And that's more than just, coming through and doing logical frameworks and then, using some AI to figure out things, even understanding our environment and then, observing a couple things in NetFlow and all that stuff. That's the beginning. You really need a detailed knowledge of both all your real and potential threats, ones that are relevant and contextual to you, countermeasures for them. You need to apply applications of theory, be perceptive to what's going on, monitor where you need to and how, classify and model what you see, and basically do everything. And really break down and use the principles of logical analysis to understand what's in front of you, link it back to activity, and then incorporate causality. So let me see if I can give an example that's not too confusing. Causality, in a sense, if I see X, then Z, F, or Y must exist because they are, again, causes to this effect of X. So if I had phishing occur, then phishing had to have come in through email. It had to come in through, say, SMS or another factor. If I observe that I can see that there's email going to the person who was phished, and I can see also that there was SMS messages that they received, I could then incorporate some elements of knowledge and go, well, if this is the attacker I think it is, this attacker only uses email. And therefore I could posit that if I truly believe it's this attacker and I can eliminate SMS, I can look in that channel for phishing in email and go, okay, it must have come from the email. And if I can go and then observe that that's true, I can test and do a use case and then understand more potentially about who did it, how they did it, why they did it, and so on. There's a lot to understanding causality and all the different types of analysis here. Cybersecurity is a struggle. I think I made that point abundant. So let's move on. Let's talk about the rest of this. I talked about observational science earlier. Let's talk about the descriptive science. I promised that it was a little bit of both, and you're kind of going to see why. Descriptive science is really tightly linked to observational science, so it makes sense that they're really close cousins. Descriptive science is all about observing, recording, describing, and classifying things, not just watching it, but actually break it down, classifying, categorizing. And if you think about our field and how much we do with cybersecurity actors and threats and vulnerabilities and exploits, we do exactly that. And it's kind of combined with our observational piece from the observational science side. Descriptive research is sometimes contrasted with hypothesis-driven research, which really focuses on testing more than anything else to see if a hypothesis is true or not, and all that kind of the good stuff. The application of this is really, really appropriate methodology for what we do, as many observations as we make and the much that we need to classify, especially when you take into account the completely unpredictable nature of cybersecurity. We touched on that earlier, and I won't go back through it, but really, we place emphasis on recognizing what is occurring, what could, can, and may occur. And that's what makes this link back to the earlier types of science. And I've got some things over here in the graph, but mainly it's just there to focus in on the different types. And I don't want to spend a ton on this. You can read more about descriptive science if you like, but I really want to move into a couple relevant topics here. And one of those is metrics. And don't worry, I'm not going to bore you to death. Most people don't have a clue what actually metrics is. They can spell it, but they really don't know what it means. And don't worry, you're not alone if you're a beginner going, why would I do metrics? What is metrics in the first place? Well, I'll make it simple. Metrics is all about measuring things. And the key thing about metrics is you have to learn to measure what matters. And most people don't know how to do that. It's just a gap in their education, if you will. They haven't gone through the process. They maybe know how to perform metrics. They know how to gather up data. They know how to measure it. But measuring things that matter is the key part. You have to really break down what matters, turning the same kind of analysis rubric you use against your enemy on your own actions so that you can focus in on, okay, I need to take care of just these key things. But that's not really what I want to talk about, but it's important to understand what metrics is. So really what I wanted to address is something that is a big, what I consider issue in the cybersecurity field, just like the very first thing I opened with. In this case, you may hear people say something really what I consider dumb, where they may go, in this field of cybersecurity, there are no absolutes, except that there are no absolutes. And or something to that effect. It's kind of a crazy phrasing in my head, and hopefully in yours too, because it's very circular. I mean, I want to just shake those people and say, do you run in circles much? But maybe they don't realize that this statement is circular reasoning. And if you're curious, you can look up the definition for circular reasoning. This is actually a very good example of it, because it's a logical statement that just restates its premise as the conclusion. And maybe they mean it to be funny. Maybe they just want to point out how ridiculous our field can be sometimes. The work we do sometimes is just insanely contradictory and weird. And you're just like, how am I getting into this? Well, that's okay, but it's frustrating when it's stated that way because it causes division and decisiveness. Really, if I had to boil my noggin and figure this out, I think those folks are alluding to the idea that it's impossible to make any absolute security predictions or even attain some kind of perpetual, everlasting security protection in relation to information. And they'd be right. It is. It's very difficult because security is and always has been throughout history an arms race, right? Between those who want to protect information and those who want to circumvent those protections. It's very fair to say, as an example, that the ciphers of today that we think are awesome, that we think are the best ever, will be trivially broken in the future at some point. It will be nothing for them, and there will be a new set that will replace them because of the arms race. But the problem with this is often the beginning of that part about there's no absolutes, there's no way to get there, it's impossible, it's unattainable, it's unattainium. It starts creating this attitude where people adopt an attitude that they should just shrug their shoulders. And you're like, there's a data breach. We got it breached. We had an attacker get in. We lost some data. Somebody phished us. Man, it's just another one. It's another day at the work. That's bad. That kind of attitude becomes an excuse when it comes to security. They try to say, hey, because I can't reach this absolute, I can't even figure out some kind of idealized metric to get to and judge whether I've even made any kind of security inside of my environment. They just go, well, I'm not going to do anything. It becomes this excuse kind of driven atmosphere, and it makes no sense. Now, I'm going to stop because I don't want to stall there, but I will talk about the fact that no security and absolute security, which is my first bullet there, they're two endpoints of a spectrum. No one lives at either one. No one's at any end of the spectrum. I haven't seen a company or a person's hardware or software that has absolutely no security or has every security. Mainly because no security implies zero security, no privacy, no access, complete unfettered access, or zero access, zero nothing. Nothing's there. Anybody can get to it. There's nothing in place. Nobody can stop it. It's just completely unfettered. Not happening. That's no more visible and seen than the opposite, where some kind of system or computer is completely impregnable. Right? It can never be, not just now broken in, but never ever be broken into. That idea that absolute security, some kind of absolute security impregnability actually exists. That's kind of a lofty aspiration for many security people, but it's really impossible to achieve. But what you can do with that idea of zero to absolute is get a spectrum to measure on. Somewhere in between no security and absolute security is where you are, and also where you want to be. And I hope that especially makes sense, because part of this has been trying to define for you that security really is about the protection of data. And when you can measure that, and you measure how well you're protecting data, how secure it is at the present, like putting it out of the reach of any kind of unsafe actors and making sure that the only copies of that data that you're protecting are the authorized ones that should exist, not versus unauthorized ones. That's a status. That's a measurable thing. That's something that you can use as an important metric and should be a metric in your cybersecurity program. Somewhere on that scale of no security to absolute security is where you are and where you're trying to get. And that gap can be measured, and you can talk about how you move forward and back and forth, forward and backwards. Hopefully always forward, but that's not realistic either. Now, I've had people come up to me during these lectures and ask questions afterwards, and I want to address this one because this is a big one. What about public concerns? That's why I talk about the privacy of items versus the public needs. It's tough to do business or even be in government and support transparency if you don't make some data public. You have to make things public. It's possible whether you're in government or if you're working in a business. You need to work. You have to tell your customer where you are, how to get a hold of you, how to email you. You open up and expose information. And that's okay because it's needed and necessary, but you still have to protect it. What people often mistake is that public does not mean unfettered authorization and access. Right? And that concept is why we have these things where you set things only to read only, or you allow people to read and write to something. You may say this is read only to a certain segment of this public population, and then more information then can become visible after they authenticate and they tell you they're actually a person versus some kind of bot or an automation script. In fact, that's part of the mitigation strategy, where if you're a government entity or something similar and you have to publish information, you make it accessible in ways that make sense. Absolutely public, absolutely visible. Anybody who is a concerned citizen that needs to get access to it can gain access to it. They just don't need to see all 10 megs of it all at once. I'm going to give it to them in smallest chunks and make it available. Better yet, I'm going to serve them better by trying to focus them in on exactly their question and giving them only that information, versus just putting out a whole ton of information out for download. That does not help you. That actually harms you in many ways. But that factor, among many others, is part of the complex problem of reality. If you think about it and you accept that security is measurable and it's a metric that can be measured and exists on a sliding scale, then clear targets of measurement are, in fact, very accessible. And equally, in fact, required in order to have a chance of discovering whether you've attained anything or lost it and why. I mean, too often we're expected as cybersecurity professionals, or just people, as concerned people that are trying to just live in this world, we're expected to just passively await for the arrival of bad tidings, right? We're like, oh, another breach. Sorry, your data got lost. It's an excuse, especially here in the United States, by many companies. Well, we tried to protect it, but we didn't. And they're like, oh, well. In some cases, there are some legal justifications where you can sue back or you can become part of something, and maybe they even provide a package. All that, they do it because it's less expensive for them, for more than anything else. But before I go down that trail and get sidetracked, this passivity kills us. We're being trained poorly to just await the arrival of bad things, especially when it comes to system exploits. Not just talking about data breaches and things like that, but software that's being released that is being pushed out without a concept of security from the beginning or even any part of the process. Part of the biggest problem in cybersecurity not only is not knowing what to measure and measure what matters, but you don't have that full knowledge of what it is to have a key goal or measure of security. Like, how do you not only know what to measure, we've kind of talked about this briefly, but know what it is that you're trying to get to and how you can measure it. Frequently, it's that no absolutes attitude that kills this idea. It becomes an excuse, especially back on my earlier topic, for designers of security systems or software. Because it's like, there's no absolutes, sorry, somebody got in, or sorry, data leaked. It kind of gives them a get out of jail free card. It's a clause they can go, it just happened. And they don't feel like they need to explain things or even have to necessarily even understand how the security of target failed. They just go, yep, it happened. We should not accept that. And if anything I could encourage you to do is to push back on that thought constantly. Don't accept that successful exploits of any kind are just natural. Like, yep, sorry, we pushed software out, somebody's going to exploit it. That kind of thinking builds in an excuse. It creates a lack of absolutes or an absolute in the security as a whole, and makes it an illogical argument that, because we don't know, or we just didn't know, or because we just had poor defenses, well, sorry, that's our excuse. It should not be a valid excuse for failure. Because when you accept that kind of thought, it puts the symptoms of what's going on ahead of the cause. What really needs to be focused on in this part especially is to define continuous security as the goal. Continuous security, whether it's from the design phase through the actual implementation and protection of it, which in itself I completely admit is a type of absolute. Because if you don't do that, how can you define successful protection of data and privacy, right? It becomes this thing, and I'll give you a definition right now, a kind of temporary state that you want to consistently achieve. I want to be secure. I know it's going to be temporary, but I want to work on consistently achieving that. Now, I'm not claiming at any point that if we knew everything and we had great security and we had continuous security, that there would not be zero-day exploits. They're going to happen. There are unknowns out there. There are unknowns in terms of system design and operation. There's unknowns in how people are going to act. There's too many aberrant and chaotic factors in order to say that. There will always be a zero-day exploit. As a note, 0 day just means you could not see it coming. Therefore, it happened on the day 0. But skipping all that, we should not allow that to have that be an excuse, but should identify and have them and request bona fide, identify realistic and true explanations for our security failures. Not hide behind some kind of logical conundrum or meaningless mantra of, well, okay, sorry, it just happened, bad security, blah, blah, blah. No. Embrace the truth. And the truth is that there's a complete lack of precise, logical, and measurable security targets. And that's what really holds us back in the cybersecurity industry. You may have a company, you may have 5 people on your staff, and they're all protecting you, but you don't know how well they're protecting you unless you have a way to measure it. If you don't know where your security is now and where your security is supposed to be, you can't measure anything. You have no idea of the success or failure of your program. And if you take the idea that the lack of absolutes means that things are going to happen, oops, sorry, bad defense, or it's just a given that someone's going to exploit our software or get into our company, then you give them the excuse that you never need to measure because, well, we got breached. Who are you going to point the finger at? The people that you have no idea whether they did a good job or not? That doesn't make any sense. And that's why people grasp after different ways of trying to measure metrics. It's like so many indicators. It's so many actions. I read so many articles. I looked through whatever. I'm in 16 sharing groups. None of those are metrics that matter. What matters is where you're at, where you're trying to get at, how far the gap is, and what you're doing to make that edge forward or backward. And it's something that is a complex metric that has a couple of sub-pieces to it, but that is one of those few metrics that matter and are absolutely a great measurement of your cybersecurity program. I'm going to pause because this is obviously a subject I like to get into. Let's talk about and do a short wrap-up in this part 1 of this series of lectures on the way or the path of cybersecurity. As a beginner, you're entering in this field for the first time. You may have good information under your belt about computers and cybersecurity. You may have very little. But one thing you need to know, there's 2 types. You need an injection of 2 types of information no matter where you're at. One of those is practical application techniques and the knowledge to use them. That's what you will be doing day to day. You need that. That is effectively, if you're into martial arts, the sparring. Teach you enough techniques so you can learn to start moving back and forth. You get the practical application of the exercise. I show you how to do bicep curls. You go out and do bicep curls all the time. You get really good at it. That's the point. Just because you know how to do bicep curls doesn't mean you're now a bodybuilder. They're not equivalent. Practical application, practical uses, And people laugh at my examples, so don't worry if you're laughing as I say this. Practical applications, practical uses of your techniques will be what you need. That's one type. The second type is high-level concepts of cybersecurity and who they impact, affect, and and who they impact, who they affect, and how they adjust cybersecurity. This is step one. This is part one of this series, the first lecture. Please join me in the other lectures, and I hope to see you join me on those other lectures, because my aim is to provide that second part, that high-level understanding of what you need to be successful, not just now, but in your full career, and in other things outside of the lectures, give you those practical application techniques so that you can be successful right now and get very practice at those, and then build on top of those for more complex multi-factor tasks, if I could talk, tasks that are in our particular career field. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you on a future lecture.